He's a face from BC's political past who's forever changed its future.
It's the first time in the British Commonwealth that the people actually had a say in how it is they're taxed.
And the people of British Columbia have sent a message to the provincial government. They don't want the HST. A campaign spearheaded by former Premier Bill Vander Zalm.
They can't simply do things because it's the will of a premier or the party.
2 years ago, newly re-elected Premier Gordon Campbell announced BC would adopt the harmonized sales tax, which adds an extra 7% to many items and services. It sparked outrage. And Vander Zalm's Axe the Tax petition, which got enough signatures to force Gordon Campbell's resignation and a mail-in referendum. 54% have voted to go back to the old tax system.
While I am disappointed with the results, the public has very clearly spoken, and now is the time to turn the page.
No HST. I'm very happy.
Business owners like Ron Zalko, who lost customers by having to charge 7% more, are thrilled.
They made my day today. The people of British Columbia have spoken.
Other industries like manufacturing and film production have lost a competitive edge to Ontario, which is keeping the HST.
They may be the first ones to go down to Los Angeles and talk about that they've got a better tax regime than we do in British Columbia, and we're more competitive.
That could give Premier Dalton McGuinty a boost going into this fall's election, unless Ontario voters decide they too want to axe the tax. But it's not that easy. BC has to give $1.6 billion back to Ottawa, and it could take 18 months to bring the old tax system back. Shannon Patterson, CTV News, Vancouver.
So everything in this town, of course, is seen through a political lens, and over again, CTV's Legislative Bureau Chief Jim Beattie today in that scrum with the Premier, she faced the question, will there be a fall election? What do you think?
We kept asking that question. You asked it, I asked it, and she continually refused to answer every time she was asked the question. Election still is a possibility. She could call a fall election. BC Liberals are clearly fundraising. They are trying to get the election machine up and going. So we know that is going on in the background. But honestly, I would say, following a decisive defeat like this that clearly shows that voters are angry, I would find it very hard to believe why the BC Liberals would want to go to the polls, particularly right now.
But tellingly, she did not rule it out. So let's turn to Ottawa here. And you made it clear that British Columbia voters are now on the hook for $1.6 billion that we owe Ottawa. How's it going to play out?
Well, you remember how it happened. Ottawa offered BC a $1.6 billion incentive if we would bring in the HST. So we brought in the HST, we got the $1.6 billion, but you know what? Now BC has flip-flopped, so Ottawa wants the money back. Now BC this year has to book that $1.6 billion as debt, but BC doesn't want to pay it all back. They were trying to negotiate perhaps a lesser payment. The agreement, though, says BC has to pay it back, and if BC doesn't, Ottawa can keep our transfer payment. So no matter how it goes, Ottawa holds all the cards in these negotiations.
And Finance Minister Kevin Falcon making clear today that those negotiations will not be taking place in the public.
Yes, unfortunately.
Okay, we'll hear more from him in a little bit, but thank you, Jim.
Joining me now from Victoria is Michael Prince, a social policy professor at the University of Victoria. Thanks for being with us tonight. I'm wondering your thoughts on the results. Any surprise here?
Well, given the high degree of discontent around the tax, last year the polls showed that 85% of British Columbians wanted to axe the tax. So certainly over the last several months, the government's tried to address those complaints. They offered a 2% tax cut in the HST, but not for another couple of years. But that brought down the level of discontent. But as we've seen from the results, pretty clear majority, 55% have rejected and asked the government to now axe the tax.
Did a lot of people vote?
1.6 million people. It's about a 52% turnout of the elected, of eligible voters in the province. That's pretty close to what a standard general election turnout has been in the last 3 provincial elections here in BC. So this has been a massive turnout on this mail-in ballot.
So what does this mean now for the provincial government? And I'm wondering if you can address as well in your answer how the province pays back Ottawa all that money that they now owe.
Right. Well, what the province owes is approximately $1.6 billion. This was money transferred over from the Government of Canada to the province of British Columbia over the last few years. It was doled out in installments, so to speak, and that was to both a kind of a signing bonus to encourage the province to actually move towards harmonizing the GST with the PST, but also Ottawa was to assume administrative costs and transition costs to move to the new harmonized. So the province now is on the hook to return that $1.6 billion. That's the subject of negotiations. The question isn't, will it go back? Yes, it will. It's a question of, will it be stretched over 1, 2, or possibly 3 budget years to try to minimize the impact it'll have on the bottom line in any given year.
And last question for you. What does this mean for the next provincial election in BC? When will people be heading to the polls now?
Right. Well, Christy Clark became Premier just in the spring. There's been talk about her wanting to have her own mandate. There's been a lot of election rumors swirling around the capital here over the last few months. We thought we might be going to the polls in October. The next election's not expected or doesn't have to be till 2013, but I think this is going to give the government cause to just take a breather and see how what this means politically. We might still see an election perhaps next spring, but I think the odds of an October election now have diminished a bit with this defeat of the tax.
All right, Michael Prince for us tonight from Victoria, BC. Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
The Canadian Press.
I carried through on the commitment that the government had made to have a referendum.
That was your choice.
Absolutely it was. On a tax that was introduced before I got here. Now, in a way that people weren't happy with. And I'll say this about the process, is that I think that whatever the outcome, and it's not the outcome because everybody knows how I voted in this, I voted no. But I think whatever the outcome, we are better off for having had this process.
And we made the decision to piggyback on something that was happening in Ontario with their introduction of the HST and their agreement with the feds. And we should have stopped and had that discussion with the public first before we made that decision to go forward. And we're responsible for that decision. And I don't think we've ever been able to overcome that.
We're feeling fantastic. This has been a great day for the province of BC and for Canada. I think we've shown that democracy can work the way it ought to work, where in fact the government has to consult the people. And if they don't consult the people will come back and make it known what they need to do or ought to do.
I voted to keep the HST, and I'm a little stunned with the results. I'm a small business owner, and it's going to make things more complicated and a little difficult.
I'm happy about it. I'm happy, but also kind of nervous about what the government has in store for us next.
I'm a bit indifferent about it. At the end of the day, it's a couple percent here and there. So either way, I'm not too fussed about it.
I wasn't surprised, but I am disappointed. I work in international trade and investment, and I know this is going to have some impact on our international filings.
The Canadian Press.
So to talk more about what this means for the government in BC and also perhaps in Ontario, the co-hosts of our new political show, National Affairs, are joining us, Tasha Kiridan and Rudyard Griffiths. So, Tasha, maybe I'll start with you. The HST is dead in BC. Are Christy Clark's Liberals also dead? Is this what this means?
Well, it could be. We'll see. I mean, she made all the efforts and promised to reduce the tax. That was her attempt to try and avoid this exact result. And now people are saying that an election might be postponed because she was looking perhaps to call a fall election, riding on the coattails of a victory that she wanted. Right. So, of course, Adrian Dix of the NDP sees this as victory for the NDP. They were fighting against the tax, and it certainly will hurt the Liberals whenever that election's held. Right.
So, Rudyard, did Clark make a big mistake here? Could she have salvaged this somehow?
Well, she tried, Jacqueline. She sweetened the offer on the table here to BC voters. It wasn't enough, though, to close the gap in terms of passing this referendum. And I agree with my co-host, Tasha, that this is a blow to Christy Clark. Her strategists have got to go back to the proverbial drawing board to figure out how she doesn't end up as the Kim Campbell of BC politics. I mean, this Liberal Party has really got to rethink their game plan going into the next election having registered this loss.
What about the economics of this? What will it cost to reverse? I mean, I saw a figure of $1.5 billion to maybe $3 billion, so some pretty wild fluctuating costs. We don't really know, but they're going to have to repay a chunk of money to the feds, plus the cost of implementing this old system again. And where are they going to get that money? It's going to be a bit of a nightmare. Some people might even say it's going to cost that province. They're heading down the road similar to California.
$3 billion was the warning that Christy Clark was saying. That's what it's going to cost. And Ottawa's already made noises today saying we want our $1.6 billion back. So certainly it will cost BC taxpayers, and that goes to the whole root of this thing. Was this really a protest against the tax, or was it against how it was brought in? I think it was the latter.
Yeah.
Well, and Jackie, it's interesting you mentioned California there in your question, because to me, that's the cautionary tale, and maybe my co-host here, Tasha, will disagree with me, but I think too much democracy can be a bad thing.
Oh, no.
You look at a California where voter referendums have literally crippled the tax code, have crippled revenues in that state, other states across America. It's adding to the problems of the U.S. recovery out of the 2008 financial crisis, and I think this is a bad omen, a bad trend if Canada follows the U.S. down the road to proverbial tax perdition with these types of referendums. Tasha, come on back.
I would beg to differ. I think, look, California has a lot of problems. Part of them do stem from the excess, I would say, of referenda that they had. You got to remember, this is the only referendum BC has actually ever had under its law. It's been on the books since the 1990s. And in fact, what this does is it shows that direct democracy does work. It holds politicians to account. If anything, what you're probably not going to see now are other provinces having direct referendum legislation, unfortunately, because they see that it can actually make a difference.
As a fiscal conservative, you know that these consumption taxes are the types of taxes we need. They're more efficient, they're more fair than taxes on income.
Rudyard, I'm not going to disagree.
By caving into political pressure for a referendum, by going through this process, we end up with a public policy result that's bad for the BC economy, and I think ultimately is going to be
now, they're not caving in, though. Think about it. They're not caving in. What's happened here is that a government made a promise and broke it. I agree that the consumption tax route is better. I think that the HST is not a bad tax for BC because they reduced income taxes at the same time. That's not what happened in Ontario, for example, where the HST was brought in. It was not a concomitant reduction in income taxes. If you combine reduced income taxes and bigger consumption tax, good result for the economy. The problem was the failure to keep the promise, and that's why this referendum is important. Yeah, the result may not be economically as sound, but it does tell politicians you better watch it, because if you don't behave, you don't keep your promises, you will get a kick in the head from voters.
What about I want to ask both of you, what about the effect on Ontario? Because Finance Minister Dwight Duncan in Ontario is saying, oh, this is great, we'll gladly take the business that they're going to lose in BC because we've got our blended tax and we're going to do really well. I mean,
he's got to see a silver lining in there somewhere, Jackie, because he knows what this does is potentially hurt the Liberals in Ontario, because they were, of course, champions of the HST there, and the Tories are sort of sweetening the pot also. They're not going to reduce the HST on everything, but on certain things like energy.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a wash. I'd agree with Tasha. Tim Hudak and the Progressive Conservatives here in Ontario came out very strongly against the HST in 2009, but have backed off. They're only going to take it off home heating, hydro. I think it's a bit of a wash.
What do you mean only?
Wash in the election, in the coming Ontario election. And I think, frankly, Ontario voters, Ontario business understands that we maybe now have a strategic advantage, as you said, Jackie. If BC doesn't have this, and I'm thinking about where I want to locate my company in Canada, Ontario might be preferential to British Columbia, and the tax confusion that's going to play out in that province in the months to come.
What about the net effect of, they're calling it a victory for democracy out there in BC, but is this going to also maybe play in the reverse, in that politicians are not going to say, well, clearly we have to hide these taxes. We can't leave them open and visible anymore. Does that matter? Rudyard, and then I'll ask Tasha.
Yeah, great point, Jackie. I think we really, as voters, have to be very careful about these boutique taxes that politicians use to curry votes with different constituencies, firefighters, the home renovation industry, with targeted tax cuts that do nothing for the larger population, that complicate our tax code. We got to go back, hopefully in BC eventually, to, as Tasha and I were saying, a tax based on consumption. It's fair, it's equitable, and it's good for our economy.
I'll agree with you on that. The only thing is, remember, the last federal election was basically won on those boutique tax cuts, so I don't think politicians are going to necessarily be doing that. It would be nice, though.
We'll keep watching. I'm sure we'll be talking more about this. Tasha, Rudyard, good to talk to you. We'll talk soon.
We'll do it.